Ukraine's been holding its own against Russia's invasion way better than most people would have thought they would. But now, their ability to keep up the fight might hinge on some debates happening in Washington, D.C. that weirdly enough have nothing to do with Ukraine. It's a pretty strange and tough spot for Ukraine and people fighting for the cause. Daria Kalinick, who's big on pushing for Ukraine globally and helped start the International Coalition for Ukrainian Victory, put it like this: the future of Ukraine and the lives and loads of Ukrainians are basically in the hands of these American senators and representatives. But you wouldn't know it's such a big deal if you looked at Capitol Hill right now. Congress just left town for the year without okaying a new defense budget that was supposed to include a whopping $61 billion in extra military help for Ukraine. This was all part of a bigger plan from the Biden administration that also wanted to help out Israel and Taiwan, sort out some humanitarian stuff in other conflicts, and boost border security. The thing is, congressional Republicans are playing hardball. They're saying they'll only back the Ukraine funding if they get some immigration policy changes from the administration, which the Democrats are totally against. So President Biden, who's been all about supporting Ukraine as long as it takes, had to switch it up to as long as we can when he met with Ukraine's President Vladimir Zelensky at the White House. Zelensky was in DC trying to rally more support, but it sounds like it didn't go as planned. There's still a chance that Congress could strike a deal on immigration next month, which would let the Ukrainian funding roll out. Many are trying to stay hopeful, saying that they believe the wisdom of the American people. But even if aid starts flowing again, it might not last. There are more and more people in the US and Europe who aren't keen on helping Ukraine. The European Union had its own $52 billion support plan for Ukraine, but Hungary quickly put the brakes on that. On top of all that, some of Ukraine's biggest cheerleaders are getting sidetracked by other big issues, like the war in Gaza. And then there's Donald Trump, leading in the polls and talking about ending the war in Ukraine in just one day, probably by making some deal with Russia. It's very likely that Trump will be back in the White House next year. American aid's been crucial for Ukraine in fighting back against Russia for the past 21 months. But now, Ukrainians and their allies have to wonder, what happens if the support vanishes? The US has been by far Ukraine's biggest supporter in this war, dishing out over $71 billion in aid. That's a massive amount, way more than what the next 11 countries have given combined. But here's the thing, that money is starting to run low. By mid-November, the Pentagon had almost used up all the cash Congress gave them for Ukraine and the State Department. Essentially, they've spent every penny. In fact, the Pentagon even said that they're having to cut back on what they're sending over because the funds are drying up. And it's not just the US. International support for Ukraine has dropped a ton since the summer. We're talking a nearly 90% decrease. When people talk about helping Ukraine, they often think of sending over the latest tech like fancy tanks and fighter jets. But what Ukraine really needs is something a lot more basic: artillery ammunition. They've been using thousands of shells every day, which is about half of what the US used to make in a month before the war. The US is trying to up its shell-making game, but that's going to take a while. And right now, Ukrainian soldiers are already feeling the pinch with ammo shortages. Another big deal for Ukraine is the ammo for the air defense systems. These systems are crucial for protecting cities from Russian missile attacks. In fact, just recently, they shot down 10 Russian missiles over Kiev in one morning. And with Russia likely to target Ukraine's energy infrastructure this winter, those defense systems are going to be super busy. If Washington doesn't cough up more funds, the impact won't hit Ukraine immediately, because of the delay between announcing weapon deliveries and actually getting them. A former Ukrainian deputy defense minister says a month or two without new weapons could be tough, but not a disaster. But if the aid stops for longer, Ukraine's going to be in a tight spot. Even with all the help they've gotten so far, they've had a hard time pushing back against Russian-held territory this year. The big push that they started in June has only moved them about a dozen miles. General Zelensky, the big boss of Ukraine's armed forces, says the war's kind of stuck right now, with most of the action being long-range artillery fire. And keeping their current position requires loads of ammo, mostly from the US. What Ukraine can do next really depends on how much more aid and ammo they get from the US. Analysts have warned that if the aid slows down, Ukraine will struggle to keep up their counterattacks in a couple of months. By summer, they might even have a hard time defending themselves against Russian attacks. In a recent poll, over half of Ukrainians said that they should keep fighting Russia, even if international support drops, with only 32% thinking that they should start peace talks. The thing is, for peace talks, you need to have a willing partner, and Russia doesn't seem too keen on chatting. In fact, President Putin just had his big news conference where he basically said his war goals haven't changed since day one. He's still about denazifying Ukraine, demilitarizing it, and keeping it neutral. Basically, he's not just after a bit more land in eastern Ukraine, he's aiming for a total regime change. And considering Russia's reportedly lost around 315,000 troops as per American intel, it's clear he's not playing a game of small stakes. So both Ukraine and Russia look like they're in it for the long haul. But what happens if the US decides to take a step back? Franz Stefan, a defense analyst who's been in the front lines in Ukraine, says that if the US stops sending military aid, it won't mean an instant win for Russia, but it'll definitely change how the war's fought. He thinks Ukraine, which has always been big on using artillery, might have to switch tactics. Without enough shells, they might pull back from some areas and try to lure Russian forces into urban areas for street fighting. This kind of urban warfare is what many experts thought would happen when Russia first invaded in February 2022. They didn't think Ukraine could stand up to Russia in a straight up fight. But this shift to city battles would be really bad news for Ukrainian civilians. Urban fighting usually means a lot of civilian casualties, and given how rough the Russian military can be, more Ukrainian cities would end up like Mariupol or Bakhmut, totally wrecked by the war. So what if Congress doesn't show up with more cash for Ukraine? A lot of the money they've already given is actually for restocking the US's own supplies, since we've been sending a bunch of our stuff to Ukraine. In theory, the US could keep sending weapons and ammo without replacing them, but that's probably not going to happen. The Pentagon's already worried about running low on their own gear. Analyst Mark Kansian reckons that the White House is probably trying to find some legal loophole to keep funds flowing without Congress, but he's not sure there's a way to do that. But we've been ignoring an important part. It's not just the US helping Ukraine. A bunch of European countries, relative to their economies, are actually giving more. Just this week, Zelensky was hanging out with some Nordic leaders, and Norway and Denmark promised to chip in with more help. For example, those F-16 fighter jets Ukraine's been eyeing, those are likely to come from European militaries, regardless of what Congress decides. There's this report from Britain saying that European governments should really start pumping money into making more ammunition, especially if the US starts pulling back. But Europe's been a bit slow on the uptake compared to the US. Germany even admitted that they're not going to hit their target of getting 1 million shells to Ukraine by next March. Analysts have pointed out that America's defense industry is just massive. We spend more on defense than the next 10 countries combined. So if the US stops helping, Europe can't really fill that gap. They simply just don't have the capacity to pump out military gear like the US does. And Europeans are getting a bit tired of the whole war thing too. The EU couldn't get past Hungary's veto on a new aid package this week, thanks to their pro-Russia Prime Minister, Viktor Orban. Slovakia has also got a new government that's not too keen on Ukraine either. Europe's kind of looked the other way before, like after Russia first moved into Ukraine in 2014. So if US support starts to wobble, more European countries might start backing off too. While everyone's saying Europe needs to step up their game, it's more likely that they'll actually step back. Some folks are questioning why the US is pouring billions into Ukraine, especially since the war seems stuck in a stalemate with no clear end. A great example is the new House Speaker Mike Johnson, who has called out the White House for not having a solid plan on how Ukraine can win with US help. But if this deadlock does not break, it's probably not going to lead to peace. Instead, we might see an even nastier war that could edge closer to NATO countries. And remember, the US has a treaty obligation to defend these NATO members. Now, this doesn't mean that Putin's army will march into Poland or the Baltic states if they win in Ukraine. But of course, a Russian victory would mean a less stable eastern NATO border and a bigger long-term security headache for the US, that a decade down the road could end up costing way more than what we're spending now, both in money and lives. There's also the worry that if Ukraine, which gave up its nukes in the 90s for security promises from Russia and the US, ends up losing, other countries might think getting their own nukes is the way to go. This is a big deal for places with aggressive neighbors. Countries like Japan, South Korea, and even some NATO members might start to doubt how much the US would actually back them up against another nuclear power. Earlier this year, after his big trip to Ukraine, President Biden gave a speech in Warsaw. He saw Russia's invasion wasn't just a test for Ukraine, but for the US and all democracies. He talked about how Russia had come up against the iron will of America. If the US starts to waver in its support for Ukraine, other countries are definitely going to take notice. They'll be watching to see if the iron will holds up or starts to bend. So let me know in the comments, what should the US's next steps be in regards to Ukraine? And if you enjoyed this video, make sure to leave a like and subscribe for more future content.